Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Xing Fan will defend the academic thesis Between Fragmentation and Integration, the United Nations and Global Cybersecurity Regulation. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis?
Yes. Dear Dean, dear highly esteemed opposition, dear supervisors, dear colleagues, and dear friends, I'm so grateful to be here today to present my research titled Between Fragmentation and Integration, the United Nations and Global Cybersecurity Regulation. As we know, information communication technologies has offered a lot of opportunity for economical, social, and military development, but also brings some challenges like sabotage, espionage, and subversion. They have become a big part of global politics today. As a result, states are now trying to control and manage cyberspace, and many international institutions also involved to establish regulations to address cyber problems. The United Nations, as a key player in global cyber governance, has some key advantages to promote global cooperation. The United Nations covers a wider scope of cyber topics and has broader membership. It involves a high-level cyber diplomacy. The United Nations is the place where cybersecurity regulation is debated. Various actors, interests, and values, cooperation and conflicts, compromises converge at the United Nations. Despite the UN's active efforts to address cyber problems, its effectiveness in establishing global regulation has been questioned. So my research focuses on assessing and explaining the UN success or failure in cybersecurity regulation. In order to assess and explain the UN success or failure, I use the internal coordination, coalition building, and framing to structure the UN efforts in cyber warfare, cybercrime, and cyber terrorism, the three policy fields. And I use the delegation, precision, and obligation as criteria to measure the UN's success or failure. Based on these indicators set for delegation, precision, and obligation, I can give a summary on the UN's rule-making outcome. For cyber warfare, the UN has come to a high level of delegation, low precision, and media obligation. For cyber crimes, the UN has get a high level of delegation, media precision, and media obligation. For cyber terrorism, the UN has achieved a high level of delegation, low precision, and media obligation. Overall, on the UN level, cyber crime rulemaking is more successful than cyber warfare and cyber terrorism. Specifically, based on the indicators, the three policy fields match accordingly. I can find some similarities and differences between them. For delegation, there is high delegation prevailing in the three policy fields, and cybercrime achieves the highest level of delegation. For precision, the level of precision is not high across the three policy fields, with cybercrime reach the comparatively highest level. And cyber terrorism shows the lowest level of precision. For obligation, there is contingent obligation prevails, and in comparison, cyber warfare shows a lower obligation compared to cybercrime and cyber terrorism. So how can we understand these similarities and differences? I identified factors from three dimensions to explain the UN's rulemaking outcome. These factors are located at the state level, at the level of the United Nations, and at the policy field level. So in terms of delegation, the high prevailing level across the three policy fields come from the complexity of cyber issues themselves. Individual states can't address cyber problems alone, so these states share a common interest to regulate behaviors in cyberspace, and they also have a common expectation that the United Nations should have more engagement in cyber field. This is prerequisite for the UN get a high level of delegation. And meanwhile, the UN has various institutions, expertise in cyber issues. This further increases the advantage to get a high level of delegation. And cybercrime stands out across the three policy fields. The reason for this is twofold. On one hand, there are two strong state groups. One is supporters of a new UN convention represented by China and Russia. The other is the member states of Budapest Convention. On the other hand, there is a strong drive to promote Budapest Convention as a global model for cybercrime. This puts pressure on Russian side and creating their imperative for delegating to the UN. So this state group exploited the UN procedure and achieved the goal of giving the UN a higher delegation. However, for cyber warfare and cyber terrorism, there is no clear division of state group to promote a common goal. Cybercrime is more economical and less political. It makes states easier to form alliance. In terms of precision, the prevailing low high level across the three fields can be attributed to three factors. First, their regulation complexity require a large extent of technical and legal consideration. It is challenging to make a precise rule in limited time. Second, states' varying preference in concrete items complicate the negotiation and bargaining and discussion, impacting the UN's rulemaking progress. Finally, the limited role of staff in the three policy fields restrict their ability to actively promote rules. And in comparison, cyber terrorism is the least precise across the three fields. A major reason for this is the lack of a definition of cyber terrorism in many states' domestic laws. This legal ambiguity makes states just have a vague and slogan-like appeal on international stage. Since there is no strong drive to create precise terrorist rules, most of what the UN has done is gather information and capacity building on this topic. However, for cyber warfare and cyber crime regulation, there is active efforts to promote rules. And cybercrime stands out across the three fields. As mentioned before, there is two strong state groups contesting cybercrime rulemaking. One is Budapest Convention's member states. The other is the supporters of a new UN convention. Each state group has their favored rule systems. However, for cyber warfare, the situation is different. There are also possible potential framework for cyber warfare. The one is International Code of Conduct for Information Security, supported by member states of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but its principle and lacking international support. The other is Italian manual. It's created by NATO, but not fully accepted by NATO states. So there is no strong state group to lead cyber warfare regulation, and the efforts to promote to integrate alternatives are also fragmented. Second, organizational support is also important for effective rulemaking. Cybercrime rulemaking always have a single and stable focal institution. The ad hoc committee leads the rulemaking process. It makes sure smoother and coherent negotiations. However, for cyber warfare, there are competing institutions like the shift from UNGG to OEWG, and for cyber terrorism regulation, there are more institutions involved. So it's organizational consistency that makes cybercrime rulemaking more efficient. And finally, the three policy fields are all involved multiple stakeholders. But cybercrime regulation, the states dominate the process, and other actors play a relatively passive role. But for cyber warfare and cyber terrorism, non-state actors have more engagement and they provide input in every stage. This diversity of interest and the broad participation add some difficulty and also add extra work to come to a consensus. And for obligation, the contingent obligation prevails across the three fields. States always don't want to be restricted too much. So the highest unconditional obligation is difficult to come. However, the subtopics complexity require coordination, require some level of restrictions, and also require states to take some legal responsibility. So a medium level of obligation is the norm. And in comparison, cyber warfare is the farthest from the directive. Actually, cyber terrorism also should be far from the directive obligation, but its inclusion in Security Council resolutions and counter-terrorism convention adds some obligation on it. And for cyber warfare regulation, actually, having a convention is a consensus between states, and their differences just lies in the content of the convention. However, for cyber warfare, in the very early stage of rulemaking, there is a debate on the level of obligation, voluntary norms, or legally binding rules, a treaty. Cyber warfare is more tied to national security and regime security. This political sensitivity makes states prioritize the action freedom and independence over abiding commitment. I've presented the key finding of my research. It is also to introduce the contributions of my dissertation. My dissertation speaks to three research clusters. First, for the international organization's autonomy. My research provides a better understanding of the UN's autonomy in global cybersecurity governance. As evident in cyber warfare and cyber crime, the UN mainly operates as an agent of state and follows their preferences. Its overall autonomy remains relatively low. And the United Nations demonstrates a greater autonomy in cybercrime regulations than cyber warfare. While cybercrime rulemaking is more successful, the UN's autonomy plays only a minor role in that success. Second, for norm contestation, my research provides empirical contribution to the dynamics of normative contestation in cybersecurity regulation. There is a normative debate between multilateralism and multi-stakeholderism for cyber governance. My research reveals a fusion of the two models in the three policy fields. Despite rulemaking is still largely driven by states, there are varying involvement of non-state actors. And finally, for understanding of the rulemaking, my research promotes understanding the rulemaking process through discussing progress in three policy fields of cybersecurity, not just one. Cyber regulation is often seen as being driven by the competition between Western countries, especially US and Europe, defending the liberal order and the emerging powers challenge this order. My research finds the inconsistency between what states claim and how they actually act in cybersecurity regulation. And in emerging countries, China is more aligned its position with Russia rather than trying to lead the cybersecurity regulation. And emerging countries do not always have a unified stance in advancing cybersecurity regulation and to challenge the liberal order. Some countries like Brazil and South Africa, they are more allied with Western countries on cybercrime issues. So thank you for your attention. That is my presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. The opposition will now be opened by Professor Dr. Esther Versluys, Professor of European Regulatory Governance at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Maastricht.
Many thanks. Dear candidate, dear Xing, first of all, really nice to see you again, even though it's online, which is a pity, but better than nothing. I really enjoyed reading your dissertation. I think it's It contributes enormously to our empirical knowledge in terms of cybersecurity regulation. And I really learned a lot from reading it. So many thanks. I would like to ask a question about basically the last slide that you just now presented on your 3 contributions. You also mentioned them on page 14 of your dissertation. So your 3 contributions basically are, first of all, an understanding of the UN autonomy in cybersecurity rulemaking. Secondly, a better understanding of norm contestation impacting this rulemaking. And thirdly, this new insight on cyber politics. I think your presentation now also already relatively clearly outlined your findings in relation to this, but I would like to probe you a little bit more on the theoretical implications of your work, of your dissertation. And maybe let's make it, let's pinpoint it to one topic specifically, IO autonomy. So there's a lot of scholars working on IO autonomy, and you also intend to contribute to this line of research. So could you spell out a little bit more clearly what are the theoretical implications of the work that you did? How should scholars on IO autonomy, what should they learn from your research, and how should they maybe continue differently in studying IO autonomy?
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent. I think this is a question about the theoretical contribution, especially for the international organization's autonomy. From this perspective, my research is want to bridge the gap because at present there is just a limited explanation about it's about the existing research about international organizations' autonomy, mostly drive from the trade and environment cases, and also lack the attention of other areas whether the IO has the autonomy. And my research is give an empirical contribution from this perspective beyond the trade and environment cases, and I provide the empirical contribution in cyber field. In this field, my finding shows the international organization just has limited autonomies, and I also find the connection between the international organization's autonomy between its performance, and in my dissertation, my case is about the rulemaking outcome in cyber field. And my finding shows the United Nations, because I give a comparison between the 3 policy fields, and my finding is that cybercrime rulemaking, the international the UN's autonomy has more autonomy, but my finding also shows that in cybercrime, the UN's rulemaking outcome is more successful than other 2 fields. But their connection between the autonomy and the performance is that the UN's autonomy in cybercrime fields just contributes a mirror role for that its success in rulemaking the other 2 fields. Yes. I hope I can answer.
Okay, many thanks. Maybe as a follow-up question to this, so you indeed mentioned, so there's a lot of literature in relation to trade policy, to environmental policy. What should scholars in, for example, trade policy or environmental policy, what could they learn from your case studies in this particular policy field that they could change in how they look at IO autonomy?
I think from my research, it shows that about the significance of the international organization's autonomy. If we just look at the UN's function for implement some policy goals, in my case is about to do, in my case is about the promote the rulemaking, but from this, from my case, it shows the UN's autonomy is not that significant. It can't take much effect for it achieving its goal. That is, I think, that is my theoretical contribution. Maybe it's challenged some significance about the international organization's autonomy, because this autonomy doesn't make sense for its rulemaking outcome. That it can't make much sense for for the international organization to promote to achieve some specific policy goal.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Philipp Pattberg, Professor of Transnational Environmental Governance and Policy at the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here. I want to start with congratulations to the candidate. I enjoyed reading the dissertation. I think it is indeed a very in-depth analysis of a really important policy field. I learned a lot because I work mainly on environmental issues. So I had the great pleasure to become much more familiar with the field of cybersecurity. I want to ask a slightly different question, and that is a question on your explanatory variables and your explanatory framework in a broader sense. On page 29 of the dissertation, you have a really good overview of the analytical framework, and you distinguish between the dependent variables, so what you actually want to, what you observe and what you want to explain, and you have then on the other side independent variables, which are basically state power and other factors of states, the IOs themselves, and then the policy context. And in the middle, then you have strategy. However, you could also understand those strategies again as explanations, which would bring me to almost 6 different independent variables that would explain your outcomes. And that seems a bit challenging, so to speak, because you could say it's overdetermined. Can you maybe explain how you have set up this framework to be able to really explain the variation that you see in the dependent variable based on the explanatory variables that you have identified, which, if I might say so, have further subvariables. So actually you have many more variables that you identify. So an observer might say, what actually explains what? Can you elaborate a little bit? This framework helps you to understand your question. Thank you. I can't hear you, sorry.
Can you hear me now? Thank you, highly esteemed opponent. About the question, how I use independent variables to explain the outcome, because I identified many independent variables. About for this question, how to first, I used the 3 strategies in internal coagulation, coalition building, and framing. I use this way to structure the United Nations efforts in the 3 policy fields. And based on, I said, the indicators for delegation precision and obligation, I can first give a match between the UN's rulemaking facts with this indicator. So I can give a basic summary about the level of delegation precision and obligation. That is first step. I identify the dependent variables, the level, and then how to use these invariables to explain the outcome. First, because when I structure the United Nations narratives, the stories, I select the state level, the UN level, and the policy fields level to structure the story. And in the process, I pay more attention about the power symmetry, about the state groups, and also the UN staffs, and about the complexity of the policy fields. And so in the process, I have identification. I have a categorizing of the information I collected from the document, and finally, I want to make the connection between these independent variables to the 3 outcomes. It's of course in the process there is some independent variables not that important. It can make that sense in the outcomes, but because but the state level, the UN level, and the policy field level are intertwined in the process from the beginning to the end. So in this way, I can use the categorizing to establish the connection between these independent variables to dependent variables. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Might I follow up with a question on this? Thank you very much. So another way to ask my question around your framework is to probe a little bit in alternative explanations. And that is to say, I think you have actually captured very interesting and important potential explanations for what you observe. But my question is, in how far did you also consider other factors that might not have received attention? And just to give you one example of what came to my mind, so I was thinking that the broader context in which international politics is unfolding at the moment, and this has been discussed for some years under different framings. I mean, the end of the liberal order or the end of the rule-based order or whatever have you. You discussed that actually, but this could be understood as a broader contextual factor that might have been much more prominent in your explanation of observed outcomes. So can you maybe comment a bit on this idea of alternative explanations and how you have, if you did, dealt with that? Thank you.
About the alternative explanations, first, in my thesis, I actually didn't exclude it as a explanation factors in my research. For example, I explained the outcome from state level, from UN level, and from policy level, but I didn't exclude the non-state actors. A way to include other kinds of factors for explaining the outcomes for me is that I integrate non-state actors into the state level. For example, I propose a factor that is the relation between state and non-state actors. So that is a way to address the integrate alternative factors into my framework. And secondly, of course, I think my research can cover all the factors for explaining the outcomes. For example, the historical events and crisis. But I think that problems maybe exist in every paper, every writing, because the research just can focus on some specific factors. Just as I mentioned, the specific events or crisis or historical events, they of course can lead to some temporary rule-making initiatives and to explain the outcomes. But my research is just from the UN states and UN policy levels to give from my perspective, is more structured explaining. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. André Barigna, Associate Professor in International Relations at the University of Bath.
Many thanks. I'd like to start by saying that it's a great pleasure to be here, to be part of this process. I'd like also to congratulate the candidate for reaching this stage. It must be quite a combination of joy and relief to be here. Your dissertation, I really appreciated the amount of forensic work that went into it. Doing research on similar topics, I understand how sometimes difficult and let's say boring it can be to go through so many UN documents, so many statements by member states. So the fact that you've managed to do that in such a clear and articulate way should be praised. My question has to do with your choice of policy fields. And so I was just wondering if you could tell us a bit more about how you selected them, particularly cyber warfare and cyber crime. And I say this regarding cyber warfare, given that the processes and actors that are identified and assessed in this part of the dissertation are not exclusive to warfare. I mean, both the GG that you mentioned and the OEWG were established regarding the role of ICTs in international security, not necessarily warfare. Oops. And regarding cyberterrorism, given that you argue in the dissertation that part of what you understand to be cyberterrorism is integrated in the cyber warfare chapter, and the other aspects that you analyze as cyberterrorism, financing, propaganda, content moderation, are things that one could argue are only indirectly related to cybersecurity. Some people would even say that it sits outside cybersecurity. So if you could just explain us how you got to these policy fields, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for thank you, highly esteemed opponent, thank you for this question about the distinction of policy fields. About the distinction of the policy fields, to answer your question, I want to first explain about to justify my selection of cyber warfare and cyber terrorism and cyber crime. And second, you mentioned cyber terrorism. I'm not sure I understand well your question. I also need to explain the cyber terrorism as a separate policy field I looked, right? Yeah, so.
Would you like me to clarify that?
Yes, I want to explain it. So for the justification of the policy fields, the justification come from the UN's practice engagement in cybersecurity fields. Because the United Nations has facilitated discussions on responsible state behavior in cyberspace that is relevant to cyber warfare, and it has promoted the coordination of legal framework for combating cyber crime, and also it has launched the initiative aimed at counter cyber terrorism. So from the United Nations practical engagement in cyber fields, it has developed a distinct framework for addressing cyber warfare, cyber crime, and cyber terrorism, the problem in this field. So this the UN's specific engagement in these three fields allow for a structured analysis for its lawmaking role. And second, I also want to say the three policy fields has the different focuses. Cyber warfare primarily deal with state actors and national security concern. Cybercrime involves the law enforcement and cross-border the legal issue. Cyberterrorism focus on content moderation and prevent the terrorist use of ICT. Their different focuses make them useful for analyzing how the UN deal with different aspects of cybersecurity. And as for the cyber terrorism, your later half of your question, I'm not sure whether you asked me to special explain cyber terrorism as a separate policy field, right?
Yes, so the point being that when you talk about cyber terrorism, you say that cyber terrorism can be divided in two main components. But one of those components, you say, is actually explored in the chapter on cyber warfare. And then the rest of the components that you explore, one could argue, are only indirectly related to cyber security in the sense that they're about financing, propaganda, content moderation, and not necessarily about cybersecurity per se, not necessarily about the breach of the confidentiality, availability, or accessibility of information. So that was the question about why cyber terrorism specifically, and what's the added value of selecting that policy.
Yes, still I can see from several selecting cyber terrorism as a policy field of cyber security have some considerations. First, it's still about the UN's practical efforts. The United Nations has embedded the embedded cyberterrorism into broader counterterrorism efforts that involves many United Nations agencies such as the OCT and the OECD and the CETD. This agency address aspects of the aspects of cyberterrorism as part of their focus on terrorist threats, particularly in the terms of terrorist use of ICT for recruitment, propaganda, and coordination. And second, cyberterrorism is relevant to international security. The use of ICT for terrorist purpose is highly relevant both to national and international security to require a tailored, specific regulation within the international security frameworks. And finally, the cybersecurity also require a terrorist approach because the internet and social media platforms are used for terrorist purpose. This dimension of cybersecurity also needs a terrorist approach. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Marielle Weiermaas, Assistant Professor in Internet Governance, also at our Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Maastricht University.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I would also like to congratulate you on the completion of this thesis. I think it's a very substantial body of work, and it's very laudable also the level of ambition you've taken. So the ambition in comparing these three policy fields, I think, is something that indeed is very original, and that also supports your ability to contribute to an understanding of the field of cybersecurity in a broader sense. So I would join the other committee members in really applauding the amount of empirical work that you've done and in completing the thesis to this level. The question I would like to ask you concerns the role of the private sector. So indeed, as you point out in the thesis, this is not the primary area of focus. At the same time, you also indicate how exactly the role of the private sector is one of those things that really contributes to the complexity of the policy field. And this complexity of the policy field then, in your argumentation, is one of the factors that impedes more progressive rulemaking. So in terms of explanation, it actually is quite prominent in your argument. But still, I would like to ask you to explain a little bit more, but what does this complexity actually consist of? So what is the complexity that is added through the role of the private sector? And perhaps more generally, how you would describe the position that the private sector has, if any, in this global rulemaking processes? And let me just add a little bit more about why I'm interested in this question and why I would like you to think a little bit more about this. And this is because in the adjacent field of internet governance, which especially if we talk about content moderation, as you do in the context of cyberterrorism, is one of those fields where multi-stakeholderism is very prominent. So the involvement of these other stakeholders in policy making. And it's even one of those elements that is really promoted. And there's also a lot of norm contestation about whether or not it should be multi-stakeholder. So I would like to ask you to explain a little bit more about how you understand the complexity that comes from the involvement of the private sector and how you would describe the role of the private sector within global rulemaking in cybersecurity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, highly esteemed Apollo, in the complexity of cybersecurity and also about its role for the cybersecurity regulation. I know in my thesis, I have an argument that many members have some question about my argument, especially about the multi-stakeholder weakens the process, rulemaking process. I first want to introduce about that argument. When I have such argument, it means it's always in the context when it comes to achieving precise and binding rules, the involvement of private sector and non-state actors in the negotiation can complicate the process. First, I think the involvement of private sector and non-state actors it is beneficial for the delegation of the UN, but when come to the achieving precise and binding rules, first it's its involvement can increase the diversity of interest. Divergent goals and interests often leads to difficulty to achieving consensus on concrete and enforceable rules. And also the multi-stakeholders, the private sectors and non-state actors, they can foster transparency and legitimacy, but this inclusivity also can longer the negotiation process. And finally, there is potential conflict between state and non-state actors because there are, for example, the private sectors, especially technology companies, they may prioritize innovation and commercial interest, but governments focus more on the sovereignty and national security. So there could be a tension between these two priorities. This can complicate the negotiation and making it difficult to focus on unified outcomes. That is, I think, but I think this maybe relatively passive effect also can be mitigated over time and over organizational design. And in the United Nations practical efforts, whatever in cyber warfare, cybercrime, and cyber terrorism, the private sector, especially in cyber field, it's technology companies and security firms, and also other internet service providers in the rulemaking process. They can provide adversary role and expertise through consultations, and it also provides operational, and maybe it's not a policy making role, but it provides the funding partnerships with the United Nations to do a lot of initiatives or capacity building. So in this, look at the whole landscape of cybersecurity regulation, private sectors contribute a lot and play a very good role in this process. Yes.
If I may, if I will be allowed a small follow-up, since I think actually in the latter part of your answer, I think the role of the private sector already becomes much more prominent. And I would say that especially within this field, the actual implementation and enforcement of global rulemaking tends to be dependent on private firms. So that's one component to it, which means that it really cannot be done without them. And also, indeed, as you already indicated, is the element of expertise. So about the feasibility, for example, of rules that are being proposed, about the different options of how to structure procedures for enforcement. If you would just imagine like auditing procedures for platforms having to do this kind of content moderation. So in that sense, would you reflect back on your research design, and should the private sector not have been more prominent in your research design? Or not? So just wanted to poke you a little bit more about how important are they to global rulemaking? So can the UN do without them?
Thank you, highly esteemed Poland. Sorry, I'm not very, I can't clear your question very clear. So can you explain it more clear? Sorry.
Yes, I will do so. So indeed, in your thesis, you explained that private sector is one component that adds to complexity that impedes progressive rulemaking. So this would see the private sector a little bit as an obstacle to the UN taking on this position. At the same time, my question would be that particularly for cybersecurity, so for this particular domain of policymaking that in some ways is quite distinct from other fields, that maybe the private sector has such an important role that it is not so much an obstacle, but just an essential component of global rulemaking, that the UN might want to become more autonomous, that states might want to be very dominant in setting rules, but that actually in being able to develop the rules and being able to implement and enforce them, you cannot go around the private sector. So how would you, is that something that you would say makes sense to you, or would you disagree, or would you agree with that? So how unique is cybersecurity, perhaps?
The final sentence. What's your final sentence?
So if the cybersecurity as a domain of rulemaking, whether it's different from other fields, that maybe this role of the private sector makes it different.
Yeah. For my research, why I come to that, that's also argument about the private sectors. It's just because I looked at the United Nations rulemaking outcomes, and I think the more important factor for this is about at present the whole rulemaking process result is not come to a high level. So from this perspective, especially at this stage, private sectors it can't make much for the UN's rulemaking achievement, but it doesn't mean the private sectors can't contribute to this field. For example, the Microsoft and the Google, also I think almost in 2018 there is a Paris Accord, and that is a combination of non-state actors and government. They have an agreement in cyber field. So I think for private sectors, they have another way to promote cyber rulemaking, and just in my case, it's about the United Nations. It's a state-centric approach, and there is the power dynamics. So it may shadow the roles of a private sector. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. We now have time for a second round of opposition, and this second round will be started by Professor Pattberg.
Yes, thank you again. I have some problems with my connection, so that's why I sometimes have to shut down my camera. So I haven't been able to understand every word, but I hope you can understand me. That is most important. So I want to follow up on something that has been addressed briefly, the question of autonomy of international organizations. And I want to use it as a stepping stone to a very fundamental question. What is actually an IO in your thesis? You use the term UN a lot. So you say the UN does this, the UN does that in the different cases. And that's a shorthand, I think a very handy one. But if we unpack that a little, I think you would agree that international organizations have at least two components. One is the member states, and the other is the bureaucracies that perform certain functions for the member states. And then you can question whether there's autonomy. However, in the empirical parts of the dissertation, that isn't always, I think, clearly distinguished or discussed. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on what you actually mean when you say the UN has done something.
Thank you, highly esteemed Poland, about what is the United Nations in my thesis. I think this about the defining the United Nations. I want to answer this question from two perspectives. First is about, of course, in my thesis, I first put the United Nations in the regime complex of cybersecurity. That the UN is the UN system is a whole, because in the fragmentation of cybersecurity, there are many other institutions involved in this field, and the relations between UN and other international organizations, they are complicated. First, they have some overlap in the members and mandates, but for the cybersecurity regulation, they also have some complementary with each other, or sometimes is competing with each other. That is first the perspective position the UN in the regime complex of cybersecurity, and second, the UN is within the UN. The United Nations is operates as a federation with various numerous agencies, and each agency have its mandate and expertise. But about this perspective, this constellation first ensures the UN can operate as a federation because it includes various institutions, and of course it can address various aspects of cybersecurity from the cybercrime and to internet governance, and also the cross-border data access, cross-border access to data. And each agency within the UN system can play a distinct role, but this within the UN federations, sometimes these agencies, of course, competing with each other, as evident in cyber warfare and cyber terrorism, because of the overlapping mandate and the divergent priority. This is also echo my title. It's between the fragmentation and integration. On one hand, it can mirror the complexity of global cyber governance, involves multiple interests and power dynamics. But this structure of the UN can both enable and restrict its ability to regulate cybersecurity. It, on one hand, can allow it to address multifaceted of cybersecurity, but sometimes the absence of a single and stable institution in practice for cybersecurity regulation also can limit its ability to creating binding and precise and effective regulations. So in summary, about what is the UN, in my thesis, I need to see the UN from two perspectives. One is about put the UN in the regime complex of cybersecurity. One that is above, that is the global level, and then within the UN system, it's a federated, it's a federation with various institutions to address cyber problems. But this role can have the possibility both to restrict or promote its role in this field. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Bariha.
Thank you. Dear candidate, obviously this process is a long process. We start with certain assumptions about what we may conclude even before we start the research. But then obviously, as we go about and as we find more and more information and as we analyze it, we come to often surprising findings. And so my question is in that line, going back and looking back at what you found in your dissertation and thinking about when you started working in this area, what do you think were the aspects that most surprised you in terms of your findings?
Surprised me. Thank you, highly esteemed opponent. The most finding surprised me. I think the most surprised me is about my research identified the factor influencing the UN's rulemaking success, and as demonstrated by the comparison between the cyber warfare, cybercrime, and cyber terrorism. Cyber regulation has a stable and focal institutions because in the three policy fields, the overall rulemaking outcomes is that cyber crime rulemaking is more successful than cyber warfare and cyber terrorism. And of course, I identified various factors to explain the United Nations rulemaking success. And for me, I think the most obvious, the most important factor for the cybercrime success is that just cybercrime, there is always has a single and focal institutions to regulate the rulemaking process. And just cybercrime has a strong leadership to make the rulemaking. So, and also from this comparison, I at least from the comparison of the three fields, it shows that in the international institution, when the international institution deal with a complex issue, it's a centered approach rather than a fragmented and decentralized approach is more effective for the international organization to achieve its goal. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We now continue with Dr. Weiermaas.
Right, thank you, dear candidates. So together with your thesis, you also provided us with the list of propositions that I read with great interest. And I would like to ask you about proposition number 8. So in that proposition, you propose that you argue that there's a need for more coherent and centralized approach to cybersecurity regulation. So I would like to ask you to explain why you think this is the case. So why do you take this stance? Why do you argue for more centralized approach to cybersecurity regulation? And what would you think that this would actually mean for the content of the rules that would be made? So if indeed we do, as you argue, move towards more centralized rulemaking in cybersecurity, what effect would this have on the content of the rules that then get made? Thank you very much.
Thank you, highly esteemed opponent. The proposition 8 about.
Yes, precisely.
Need to book. Sorry, I don't understand your
Okay.
question.
So in proposition number 8, so I will read it. You say that a comparison of the UN's role in regulating cyber warfare, crime, and cyber terrorism shows that its effectiveness is undermined by dispersed authority. And this highlights the need for more coherent and centralized approach to cybersecurity regulation. So my question is, why do you argue that that is the solution? So is it necessary the solution to go towards more centralized approach to cybersecurity regulation? But also, would this affect what kind of rules that then get made? If it becomes more centralized, does that change the content of the rules?
Yes, this argument just come from the comparison between the three policy fields, how to say this? Because in the comparison, for example, when I explain cybercrime standards across the three policy fields, and it is for cybercrime regulations is always a coherent and single and focal institution to lead the rulemaking, and in cyber warfare there are competing institutions there is regime shift, and there is also a new institution creations, and in cyber warfare there is a dispersed and decentralized approach to make rulemaking, and for cyber terrorism also various institutions involved in the process. There is also no centered leadership of some specific organs, and from the final outcome of rulemaking, we also can see just the comparison shows the leading agency is lesser, is much better for the rulemaking outcomes. So just from the comparison, I can come to that conclusion. It's a centered and a coherent approach is favorable for the rulemaking outcomes, but not this dispersed and decentralized approach. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have 1 minute left. The Bedell is going to join us very soon. Marielle, were you happy with the answer to your question?
Well, I can add a brief follow-up. So I completely follow your line of argumentation, and that this is indeed a logical outcome of the analysis that you've done and the findings that you've presented. But still, and this is of course largely because I study Russia, so I'm very much familiar with one particular stance that one of these states takes. So my question. So I ask the chair if I can finish the question. Okay. So the question is like, do you expect, so if you say, I follow your argumentation that more coherence and more centralized would lead to more rules, perhaps. But does it also change the content of the rules? So if the UN would become more prominent, if it's more centralized, would, for example, the types of stances that Russia occupies then also get translated into the rules? Or do you think that that's not necessarily the case?
Thank you so much. This is for another discussion. Now I will close this part of the ceremony. It will still continue. But Xing Fan, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee here present on screen will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return. Xing Fan, the degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense in view of its positive verdict, and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Konzelmann is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Thank you. Xing Fan, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
Thank you. By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Xing Fan, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached to that degree by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor, and affixed with the official seal of the university, shown by the beadle. Okay, I have been asked to immediately continue with my laudatio, but first of all, let's give Xing a round of applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's always a very nice moment for a promoter to speak these words, dear Dr. Xing Fan, and to convey our heartfelt congratulations from Hilke and from myself on your achievement. We are truly happy to see you holding the PhD certificate in your hands, well, not yet, but it will soon come to your hometown in China. After these years of incredibly hard work, you must be relieved and I'm sure proud. And proud you can indeed be about your thesis and also about the way in which you defended it today. It was about 5 years ago that you arrived in Maastricht as one of the very first CSC, Chinese Scholarship Council, PhD candidates that our faculty had welcomed. Growing up in Wuhan and living in Shanghai before you came to Maastricht, it must have been quite an experience for you to arrive in our nice small city. It was not just your first day in the Netherlands, but in Europe in general. From day one, Hilke and I were impressed by your braveness to start this journey into the unknown, by your commitment to making the PhD a success, and by your adaptability to a completely new academic and educational environment, by your interest in learning the ropes of Western-style political science, so to say. Then, unfortunately, COVID hit. Only a few months after you arrived in Maastricht, everything went into lockdown. From one day to the next, we were all stuck at home with little or no possibilities to meet others, with fears about becoming infected, and Zoom meetings becoming the new normal. This was quite difficult for everyone, but especially also for you, living far away from family and friends, with few possibilities to interact with fellow PhD candidates, and with little inspiration outside of your PhD thesis. In the end, you couldn't go home to China at all during the entire PhD trajectory, which was, of course, a big pity. But it was very impressive nonetheless how you continued regardless and overcame all those difficulties. The product of all of this hard work today is in front of us, decorated with an image of the board game Go, or Weiqi, as it is known in China. I hope I pronounced that correctly. It's, as we know, a game of incredible complexity that demonstrates the importance of a well-chosen strategy. And perhaps this is also a good way of describing the topic that you studied and the approach that you chose for studying it, namely the complexities of global governance and the strategies that players, including the United Nations, several agencies, but also the member states, are taking in the digital domain. Probably many or all of us share the arguments with which you start your thesis, namely that cyber issues increasingly affect all walks of life, including the area of security, that there is a need for arriving at global rules in the cyber domain, and that the United Nations and its sub-organizations are, at least in principle, well positioned to assume responsibility in this area. All the more is it important to understand whether or not the United Nations is successful in this regard, in which ways it is successful, and through which strategies. Your PhD shows very nicely how the United Nations bodies have attempted to play a role in the different areas of cybersecurity, but also the obstacles that are on the way to clearer and encompassing regulation. And as you mentioned in your thesis, and I think also became clear during the defense today, it is especially relevant to look at this issue from this perspective of a comparison between three distinct fields of cybersecurity. And I think this is really one of the major contributions that your thesis is making, to have this very broad and encompassing perspective on cybersecurity. Well, this endeavor to regulate the cyber area and to find good ways of regulating it is certain to continue over the coming years. Your PhD gives a snapshot of the current situation and does so very nicely, but it also provides relevant insights for the way ahead. This does not just apply to the area of cybersecurity. The UN has just adopted a global digital compact this weekend as part of the Summit of the Future, which shows how it is seeking to assume a central role also in other areas, including the setting of ethical and regulatory standards for AI or the protection of human rights in the cyber domain. So these topics are certainly here to stay and will remain an exciting area of study. Dear Xing, I hope you will bring your academic insights and skills and also your perseverance and energy into this discussion, be it in China or be it elsewhere. We hope that you will play a part in the continuing academic debate on the need for global cyber governance, perhaps a more coherent form of it, as we heard today, and as was also a topic of the discussion today. And of course, I do hope that we will stay in touch over the coming years. It would be great to meet again in Maastricht or somewhere else, despite the great physical distance that now exists between us. Hilke and I wish you all the best for the time ahead of you, much joy and success with your academic, professional, and private endeavors. Our best congratulations again on passing your PhD, and do enjoy this bright and sunny day, at least over here in Aachen and Maastricht. I hope it's the same in Shanghai. Congratulations.
Thank you so much for this very nice laudatio. And now I will close this ceremony. Dear Dr. Fan, sounds very nice. You will have to get used to say this. I'm Dr. Fan. Dear Dr. Fan, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you very much with the degree you have acquired. I hereby declare the ceremony as ended. But Dr. Fan, please don't leave us yet. We will still be able to talk to you a little bit in private, but formally I close this ceremony.
Okay, lovely. So what do? I think we are all